David Lee, Director of Strategic Alliance at Cloudentity. David started his career as an enterprise architect and is now considered a thought leader in the field of especially identity and access management, which is one of the major areas related to open banking. He was named the top 100 identity influencers and is famously known as the Identity Jedi. And at Cloudentity, David helps organizations embrace the future of authorization, like a dynamic authorization. And today, David will talk about open banking. It's all about trust.
Thanks, Brian, for the introduction. It's so funny. Every time I hear the bio, it's just, it's still hard to just hear people read stuff about yourself or whatever. I am known as the Identity Jedi, and I'm going to talk to everybody today about open banking, and we're going to talk about trust and APIs, right? And I think it's going to segue quite nicely, actually, to the last presenter's conversation. I won't go into as much technical detail, but we're just going to kind of walk through about what open banking kind of really means as we look at it from more of a high-level view, right? So, to kind of kick this off, I'd like to ask the question, who do you trust, right? And when you think about this question, inherently and unequivocally, like, who do you trust? I want all of you to just take a couple of seconds to think about that. The first person that pops into your mind when you read this, like, who do I trust? And maybe it's your spouse or your brother or your best friend, something of that nature, but they immediately pop into your mind. So now that you have them pictured in your mind, I want you to answer this question: why do you trust them? How much do you trust them? When you think about these two questions, we ask ourselves these things all the time. And sometimes the answer is just a known quantity or gut feeling, if you will, or it's like a standard that we've come to accept, right? I trust my brother because it's my brother. Maybe some of you don't trust your brother. I won't get into that. But if I say it personally, I trust my brother because he's my brother. He's been there my entire life. He's always looked out for me. And over the course of years, as we've built that relationship, there's been layers of trust that have added to it. So as that relationship kind of grew, there's certain things that I would talk to my brother about now that I wouldn't talk about before because we've built that, right? So let me bring this back. You said, okay, Dave, where are you going with this? You're going off and talking about a relationship with your brother. What I'm really talking about is the relationship of building that trust. And when you think about open banking, it's the same type of thing, right? If we think about banking in general, if we go back, take a step back, let's call it 20 years. Maybe go back about maybe 20 or 30 years. Forget I'm a little bit more gray than I like to admit. We built trust with banks because banks were these physical buildings that we walked into, right? There was a process that we went to when we thought of banking, right? I'm going to go down to this physical building. I'm going to do something. I'm going to open an account. I'm going to make a transaction. I'm going to deposit. I'm going to transfer money. But there was a process that I went to. There was a physical location that I went. And I established trust because I knew that that was a bank. I recognized it. It was a thing. The bank was different than a car wash or a credit union or something else. It's like, no, this is a bank. And with that bank, we assumed and built this level of trust. Why? Because banks were dealing with all this financial data that they had. And so they were kind of trustworthy. Again, that same type of trust relationship. So as we start to look at open banking, and we start to look at how we want to make sure that we can capitalize on this trend to give consumers more services, more things to do for them to better manage their money. And of course, as the previous presenter mentioned, which I thought was excellent, this is also about banks being able to grab additional revenue. There's other services they can provide because over the course of building this relationship between consumers and banks, what's happened? We've built a treasure trove of financial data. Right. I loved in the last presentation how he started with, he opened it up and showed a statement of what he did last year. And that was so cool because you could really see patterns, right, of where he liked to go, what type of foods he liked to do, like to shop at Macy's. All that stuff is information that's valuable that you could use to either turn or give it to marketers, or that you could better give your services over to your consumer. So for instance, if you're looking at that data and see that, okay, I see a Macy's transaction and it comes up twice a month, every month, consistently for the last 6 months. Well, if he started to put together his budget, they're working on a family budget, you can kind of automate and say, okay, hey, let's make sure for your shopping budget we add a little bit more because we see this trend, right? So this starts to become this relationship with this data and open it up to allow us to do some more things. But to do that, we've got to have that kind of level of trust, right? We're used to going to a bank and saying, this bank, I trust this bank. This is where I go in. I want to take these actions. So we have to get past this known versus unknown, right? When it comes to the digital world, these things are a little bit harder to come by, and it's much less implicit on the trust side. There's no known state really. There's only the unknown. When I go and go to a bank and I log in, if I bank with Chase, I go to chase.com, it doesn't know who I am until I do what? I have to present and say this is a known person to authenticate. We're familiar with that, right? At this point, authentication, we've got all the open standards. We've been doing it long enough to where we kind of understand and know the nooks and crannies around authentication. But when we're talking about open banking, we have to provide that known state, which means we definitely have to know who someone is, right? That's the authentication. But more importantly, right, the next kind of level is this intent versus action. We need to understand that this person is trusted to do what they're trying to do and that they're authorized, this user's intent, to do that action. So we get to this authorization and consent, right? So there's a difference between if I'm logging in to my account and I just want to read the transactions that I have versus I want to log in and make a transfer from my checking account to my savings account, or make a wire transfer to a large sum for a large purchase. Like, these are different things. That authorization, that intent is a little bit different. We need to understand that. And then shared versus private, right? What information do I want to share? I'm okay with showing you a statement from last year that shows you where I was at in the different places that I've gone, right? Because that was last year. Maybe that's not quite of a pattern, or maybe the things that I purchased, I don't feel are quite as sensitive versus some other things that I purchased that I feel maybe are just too sensitive, right? I don't want you to specifically know that I like to play video games and spend a lot of money on Sony PlayStation 5. Just kidding, not really. But the point is, that's up to the user of what's shared, what's private, how that gets shared, or how that data gets used. And that needs to be available to the user to decide, and then also needs to be enforced by how we use that in this open banking format. So a lot of trust that we have to start building there. So let's walk through some little examples. I'm a visual person, so let's take this out. We're going to take this user, we're going to call him Tyrion. Now Tyrion takes his money, gets paid, and he's going to put it somewhere where he can save it and where he can have it, access to it whenever he needs it. So he's going to take it to the Iron Bank. Now, this is the same bank his family has used for years, so he trusts them with his money. Now, as Tyrion's career advances, he opens up other accounts for some various purposes. He does a lot of business in Westeros, so he opens up an account there. For his employment in the city of Marine, he received a pension plan that was run by Marine Financial, so they opened up an account for him. And each time there's an account was open, there's financial data that specific institution collects and manages to better service Tyrion. So now he's got financial data sitting at the Iron Bank, financial data at Westeros Bank, financial data at Marine Financial. All in order to make sure that Tyrion can manage all of these different things as he advances in his career. Now, this model is what we've known for years, right? We've got an account. I can go to Chase. I can go to Wells Fargo. I can go to JP Morgan, all these different places, Vanguard, Fidelity, you name it, right? I've got different places where I can have institutions that I have financial information with. Maybe one's for everyday purchases, checking. I've got a credit card. Maybe it's Amex. I've got a retirement plan, right? So you have these different areas where there's this financial information, and that's where it stays. That information stays there. So if I want to go understand about my statements on my IRA account, I go log into my IRA account. And that may or may not be with the same place where I have my banking account. But as we start to look at this and we look at open banking and what that applies to it, we say, okay, well, this is a good model, but we want to open this up, hence the word open. We want to make it so that way Tyrion can access his financial data from wherever. It doesn't have to just go and log into Iron Bank and get that information there, then go log into Westeros. What if there's an app and you can see things like mint.com where I can just consolidate all of that and then offer different services and aggregating reports so I can allow Tyrion to better manage the money. Sorry for some of the bad animations here. So we then say, okay, well, look, we want to take the financial data from Iron Bank, from Westeros, from Marine, and we'll make that accessible to Tyrion and give that to him so he can access this in another app, right? And then he can see the information that he needs. And so let's say that he wants to calculate his net worth. So he needs to know every single account that he has and track his spending based on that and make long-term goals. He wants to see all this data in one place. Well, we do that with APIs, right? So APIs help aggregate all that information and present it in a user experience that's easy to navigate. For example, imagine like an Expedia of finance, right? It collates all of the best loan deals instead of flights from around the web. Now, depending on the functions of this open banking platform, you'll be able to view all your money in the different places you have it. You can move that money around at will. You can make payments and also find deals on loans, term deposits, lines of credit, more, all in one spot, right? It's the utopia of finance. I can go here and see everything that I need to do from a financial perspective, and I don't have to go in and log into each bank. In the case of Tyrion's case, if those of you who are familiar with the show, I've used all Game of Thrones type references here. So in Tyrion's case, this is super helpful because the Iron Bank is in one city, the Marine Financials in another, Westeros is in another. So he doesn't have to go back and forth and go to these. If I bring it to a more real world example, now I can go to one place and manage and see the flow of my money, how things are coming in, use that, maybe also pull in something from a credit risk scoring agency to understand how all this affects my credit and say, okay, now if I go to that Expedia example that I use, Expedia Finance, I can go see all the different loans that are available based on credit rates and, debt to income ratio. All that's there, and I can use that to help me find the best product. Again, as part of open banking is using this data and opening this data up to allow others to create better services for those consumers. So users can get to things easier and quicker, but also to create extra revenue. Maybe the Iron Bank says, I don't want another fintech to do that. I'm going to do that for my customers. So therefore, I'll have to have the API so I can share my financial data, but also be able to pull in other financial data that I can offer this service to my consumer, to my customer, which is Tyrion in this case. So we say, okay, great. Every bank, go build APIs. That's awesome. We'll all run off, we'll build APIs and we'll make this work. However, as we've just seen from our previous example, this is not as simple as it sounds. There's a lot of things from a security aspect that we have to make sure that we're doing, because this isn't just travel data what we're talking about. This is different. This is financial data, right? So we need to make sure that we're not opening ourselves up to create a system where we induce more fraud or we make it harder for the consumer. So that's a big challenge, and it always is. It's the security of this information, right? And so we can't just do some ACL or role-based authorizations, because those aren't secure enough to stand up to the needs of open banking, right? We need to instantly know the full context of who's wanting access grants to that data. Who are they? Where are they coming in from? Is Tyrion logging in from his mobile app? Is he logging in from home? Is he logging in from way? What are they wanting to access? Are they just wanting to access the savings account and view some information? Or they wanted to access the checking account and make a transfer, make a transaction, right? Why are they needing the access? What kind of device are they operating from, and so forth? These are things, as we start to look at the full context, we have to understand, because again, we have to build in the trust. It's that known versus unknown. It's different when you walk into a bank. There's features that they do to do these similar things, but it's kind of quote unquote what we call offline, right? Not things that we're used to seeing. And the bank has certain factors that they'll trust. It's like, okay, well, if this is happening from a bank within a teller within our network, there's certain levels of trust that have already been established. When we start talking about open banking, the trust is not there because you know who we're coming from, right? Tyrion's on his smartphone sitting in Belize and he wants to make a transfer. So that known state that unknown state is there. But now we have to transfer the known state. We have to be able to build APIs and intelligent security systems around them to interrogate and ask the specific questions, so we can get more and more trust as we figure out, hey, is this truly Tyrion? Is this something he wants to do, and should we take that action? So when we start to think about what that means, we look at our open banking APIs and we know that there's a couple things they need to be able to do. They have to be able to securely share data. So we have to take the financial data that we have locked into whatever organization is, these big institutions, and make it available to be shared. And so that way other parties can use it. They got to enforce customer consent, right? You got to be able to allow the consumer to say, yes, I consent to this data being moved to this location. So if I go back to that mint.com example, right, one of the big features of Mint is that you can consolidate all of your accounts and see all your transactions in one place. So if I've got my checking account and my savings account and my Fidelity account and a loan account and on so forth and so on, I want to be able to log in and say, okay, let me see all the transactions that come for the month. I can track spending completely over the month if I can see everything that's coming in. Well, I've got to give consent to say, okay, if I'm logged into mint.com, and we're going to use the example, I bank with Chase and I bank with Fidelity, right? So I say, okay, Mint, I'm consenting for you to get the checking account information from Chase, and I'm consenting for you to get the retirement information account from Fidelity, right? That consent has to be there. So that way, when it's shared, ensured securely, we know that the customer is given that consent, it is that customer. And then fine grained authorization around and to enhance that consent that says, okay, I've consented for the checking account, but I don't necessarily want transactions to take place. I just want to be able to read the data and run reports. But at the time that I do need to make a transaction, now that's a different type of authorization, and make sure that we understand the policy for that authorization. Do we want that to be any kind of transfer and transaction? Should we allow Mint to handle all transactions? So we say, okay, anything $1,000 or less, we'll allow to do from a third party, from a bank. Or so the bank can say, look, we'll set a policy that says you can get this data, and if you want to do transaction, we'll process it, but maybe only up to $1,000. Maybe it's over $1,000, you require them to come to the bank. Probably not the best user experience, but you want to have some next step, right? And this is where the authorization has to really get fine grained, because again, dealing with financial data, there's a lot that can happen here, and the ability for loss, and that's not what we want. We don't want our consumers to feel like they can't really operate the way they want to, and they're doing it in an insecure manner, and so they're not going to use the systems. We want to ride this trend as open banking has started, to make sure this is easier for our consumers to access. And so when we think about that from a layered kind of approach, right? Looking at the API, you want your user consent. So again, you want to make sure that the user is informed of what they're getting ready to share and how it's going to be shared. And you want to make sure you're getting that consent. Consent doesn't just happen just one time. Maybe it's I'm logging in for the first time and I give consent, but then 30 days later I want to come back and say, well, I don't really want this data coming back in anymore. We have to be able to capture that user consent when looking at this approach. The next is fine grained authorization. Like again, that example of being able to understand specifically what's the intent and the action that the user is trying to take. If even it's not the user, whatever, when it's going to hit the API, what's the intent and action of what's getting ready to happen? I need to make a transfer for 500 initiated by David from his laptop when he was in Belize, right? It's this type of context we need to understand. This is this something we want to do? Maybe when David's traveling, right? And I've seen this in the US with some cards. When I'm traveling, I don't get there's some transactions that get flagged. And my credit card company just picks up the phone and calls me and says, hey, just want to make sure that it's you, right? That same type of thing from an open banking perspective. Is David trying to make a transfer from the beach in Ibiza? Okay, cool. Are we sure that it's David? What do we want to do to make sure that we either have him do another factor of authentication, or maybe go through another couple of steps just to ensure that it is really him and is authorized to make that transaction. And then finally, data lineage, right? Which is something that's really important as we start to share this data and open this data so it goes to different systems. Right? In the old way, the system, the good thing about it was if you went to one bank and they had all this financial data, they didn't share it, but you knew where it was to an extent. We'll get into how they share and make money off of it in a different discussion, but it was there. It was in that bank. It was there. That's where that data was, right? Now as it starts to get open and it's shared with different aspects, got to make sure to understand and know the data and where it's going and how it's getting shared, that it matches with the user's consent and the user's aware of it, right? So as we start to look at these approaches, these are the things that we need to consider and build into our systems and architecture as we go forward, to ensure that we're building a proper open banking system, but also in general, a better open banking ecosystem, right? So one of the things that we look at when we look at open banking, it has been on a roll the last couple of years, and we're seeing, in the US, with financial data exchange, we've got PSD2. In the EU, we got things going on in Australia. Everybody's come up with their different standards, but the one thing that I'm seeing is that to create this ecosystem, right, there's got to be a trusted source of standards and practices. Right, the institutions have to know the standards and make sure that it's freely shareable across. So that way we know that it's a trusted standard, a trusted source, and a trusted list of providers. That if you're going to participate in this ecosystem, there is a certain level that you need to participate at to make sure that the consumers that are then going to use these services, right, are living up to the same standards they're used to seeing from some of the bigger financial institutions. Now, of course, obviously, there's tons of opportunity for fintechs to come in and disrupt the market and do different things. But while we're doing that, we always have to make sure that we're balancing it to make sure that we're not causing harm to our consumers in that ecosystem. And that comes with developing that trust of an ecosystem. Again, the standards, the practices, and list of providers. So when we wrap it all up and we look at it, right, we come back to that notion of trust. We need a trusted ecosystem when you're looking at open banking, right? understanding that the ecosystem, the data that's being shared across the providers in there is trusted. There's some kind of practices and some standard that's being held. User consent. This is a big thing, and we've seen this push across all technology, but specifically when we're looking at financial and open banking, the users got to be consent and understand what they're using, how they're using it, and that's got to be part of the systems that we build into. I would dare say that it's something you can't quite go into open banking and just say, hey, we've got APIs, we've opened up, we shared our data, without being able to take the user consent and saying, okay, the user's consenting to these things, regardless if there's regulations or not. And obviously, we know regulations always help. Businesses always do things when they're compelled to do. But I do think as we're starting to walk into this privacy era, we're seeing across with companies like Apple, who are making it such a big part of their latest releases of their phones and their devices, that consumers are more and more apt to understand about what privacy is and what their consent is and how their data is being used. So I think it's very important that that is something that's led with the design of these APIs. And of course, obviously, to secure APIs, right? Understanding that we're using the protocols, understanding of the protocols, and building secure transactions to allow this data to pass in a way that users can feel safe when they're given their consent. And finally, privacy. Right at the end of it, the users have to be comfortable knowing that the data they decide to share is truly their data, and they've got control of it, and they can see what's going on, and sharing only what they want to be shared and not sharing what they don't want to be shared. You pull all those together, and it kind of builds on to those 4 pillars of trust, right? And so if we go back to the beginning, with the question that we answer is like, who do you trust? It's the same thing from a user perspective as we look at this, right? Who do we trust when it comes to running or using our financial data? And it's up to us, the practitioners and the builders, to make sure that we put it in the standards. We're baking in the consent and the privacy in the ecosystem to ensure that we can deliver that to our consumers and our users, so that way they have that level of trust. So that way, when Tyrion or me are on that beach in Ibiza and they log in to use whatever app it is, and they say, "Hey, I need to transfer some money over here because I'm getting ready to go and take this ferry ride or whatever I'm going to do. Got to leave a little bit more money." That they have that trust that they can do that and know it's done securely, and they know they won't be taken advantage of. So, with that, we'll end it. Wrap it up. Nice, short, and sweet. Any questions? Feel free to pop them in the chat. And yeah, looking forward to the next discussion.